Welcome everyone to this evening's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at MSU, formerly Wonderlust, presentation, Montana's Forest Fires, Why We Just Burn Our Forests. Ollie at MSU presentations at the Belgrade Community Library are free and open to the public thanks to a CARES Act grant the library received from Humanities Montana and National Endowment for the Humanities. If you have questions about other Ollie at MSU programs or membership, please let me know via the chat, and I will connect you to one of the Ollie at MSU volunteers that are logged on tonight, or the director of Ollie at MSU, Bobby. My name is Sarah Creech, and I am the Adult Services Librarian at the Belgrade Community Library. Before I introduce our presenter, a few Zoom tips and announcements. Attendee videos and microphones are both disabled for this presentation. Questions will be taken only using the chat function. No live questions will be taken. So the raise hand feature will not be used during this presentation. Only I will be able to see the chat. I will monitor and collect questions during the presentation, wave our presenter down if any are pertinent to the slide that's being shown right now. And our presenter will pause a few times to ask questions throughout the talk. So please bring them in as they come up. The chat section is also the place to let me know where if you're having technical difficulties. To use the chat, hover over your Zoom screen and click the speech bubble at the bottom of your screen. There's a toolbar at the bottom of your screen. The chat will open on the right side of your screen if you're not in full screen mode. If you are in full screen mode, it will appear in a window you can move around your screen by clicking and dragging the top bar. To type your message, first open the chat and then click on the text that says type message here. Start typing, and your message should appear where the type message here text was. To send, press enter or return. This event is being recorded and will be available on the library's YouTube channel for future viewing and reference. It will also be sent out to all previous registrants when it's available through MSU automated system. And it is also being recorded for KGVM community radio. Closed captioning is provided by a third-party artificial intelligence service. To start closed captioning, hover over that same toolbar and click closed captioning, and it should start at the bottom of the screen. Finally, please take a minute to complete the survey that will pop up after the webinar ends. I think it's only 5 questions. Doing this survey helps the library and our sponsors know what programs bring the most interest, and it helps us improve every time. Since we can't see your faces, it also kind of gives us an idea whether you enjoyed the presentation. So, tonight's presenter has been the Montana State University Extension Forestry Specialist since 1997 and is an Associate Professor of Forest Ecology and Management housed at the Frank College of Forestry and Conservation in University of Montana. He has conducted research on a variety of forest restoration practices, post-wildfire recovery, and the role of salvage and sanitation logging, forest debris treatments and impacts on site ecological processes, climate impacts on forest processes and disturbance, windbreak establishment and maintenance techniques, and private family forest ownership trends. In 2008, he was awarded a Fulbright Scholarship to the Institute of Forests and Forest Management at the University of Weihenstephan in Bavaria, Germany. Now, it is my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Peter Kolb. Thank you, Peter.
Oh, thank you, Sarah, and certainly a pleasure to be able to share some ideas and some experience with your audience. This is, I think, a little new to all of us, but hopefully you can be comfortable on your living room couch at home and enjoy it that way more than sitting in a lecture hall. Anyways, as Sarah said, I have been working in Montana and Idaho, Northern Rockies forests for well over 30 years, closer to 40 years. And forest ecology and disturbance processes have always been my interest. And I actually really got involved with wildfires when I was doing some research on the Boise National Forest in 1994. And I was measuring different forest conditions throughout the whole forest and pretty much as soon as I finished in a certain area, it burned up because 1994 was a big wildfire year on the Boise National Forest. And so I actually got to go back the year following my initial measurements and look at some of those areas that burned. And I had pre-existing data, so it really gave me a little bit of an insight as to how fire behaved and why fire behaved and what some of the after effects have been. And well, I've been involved with fires and forests and forest ecology ever since. So Montana forest fires, why we just burn our forests. It's kind of a loaded title. And a lot of it has to do with how our forests function, what their historical function is, what our influence is on these forests, and how fires burn. So I have a lot of slides that I'm going to go through relatively quickly to kind of set the stage for what it is we're seeing and what we're experiencing. And as Sarah mentioned, please feel free to text her questions. I'm more than happy to answer those. And this is such a huge topic that we could spend many, many hours on it. And so if I'm missing something that you're interested in, please do let me know so that I'm not missing something or not touching on something that you have experience with. So when we look at Montana forests, we generally tend to see these vast expansive forests that we tend to believe have been there for a long time. They're relatively stable, and when something happens to these forests, trees die or a wildfire burns them down, it concerns us because we like to see this, and we like to hike in it, we like to recreate in it. Our water comes from there, our wildlife comes from there. But really, this picture or these forests are kind of like a book, a very thick book. And when we look at it, all we're seeing is the cover. And we really have to read the entire book, the plot, the subplots, the characters, to understand what it is that we're looking at and what we're dealing with. So to start off with, we are in an area geographically known as the Northern Rockies. Okay, so this is kind of the spine of the continent, watershed. To the east, it feeds into the Missouri and the Mississippi, and to the west, the Columbia River Basin, and we are where all the water collects on. And so it's a very unique ecosystem that's surrounded by a shortgrass prairie or Washington scablands or Great Basin, and the forests are there because we have mountains. And those mountains interact with the weather. So our predominant weather pattern that hits us is Pacific air that comes off the Pacific coast. It crosses Washington and Oregon, drops a lot of moisture over the Cascade Mountains, and then that's why we have the dry shortgrass prairie scablands area in central Oregon and Washington. And when it hits the Northern Rocky Mountains, the mountains cause the air masses to gain altitude, which cools them and causes them to drop moisture. And so to either side of these Northern Rockies, we have about 12 inches annual precipitation, which isn't enough to support trees. Trees start to occur when we get a minimum of 16 inches of rainfall. And so as these air masses rise, they cool and we get increasing rainfall. But the Pacific air masses is not the only weather pattern that hits us. We get a lot of air coming across California, Nevada, hits southern Idaho, and then moves into Montana. And you can see these big valleys in southern Idaho are big convection basins, and they create convection thunderstorms that then move diagonally across Montana and create a kind of a lightning belt across southwestern Montana. So lightning is a big part of that. But as we've all experienced as well, and we're experiencing right now with this cooler weather and the snow you got in Bozeman this morning, we get cold air coming down from Canada, and basically the North Pole. And I've had farmers out in Havre tell me there's really nothing between us and the North Pole but a picket fence. And there have been times in January where I believe them. But that cold air is very dry. It has no moisture with it. And so when that moves in, it really drops the humidity. And when it bumps up against these other air masses from the Pacific or California, it creates a lot of turbulence. And that's why places like Choteau, the Front Range of north central Montana, often experiences wind speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour. It's as these air masses fight with each other. And surprisingly enough, I learned when I first moved here, we also get air and moisture from the Gulf of Mexico that comes up across Colorado and Wyoming and hits southeastern Montana. And there's some research on Yellowstone National Park that actually shows that the eastern half of Yellowstone Park is more influenced by Gulf of Mexico air than it is Pacific air. And so Yellowstone National Park is kind of this dividing between West Coast air and East Coast air. And so the weather is often very different in eastern Montana than it is in western Montana for those reasons. And so you see we're really in a vortex of these air masses that move down across the continents and off the oceans. And they kind of swirl over Montana, and hence the old saying, if you don't like the weather, wait a couple hours, it's going to change. And that's something that's very, very unique to the Northern Rockies. So, and just to emphasize, the topography interacts with these air masses, not just in the moisture and the temperature shifts, but these big basins also create these convective thunderstorms. And this is a very important process when it comes to fire, because one lightning storm can produce, that moves across Montana, can produce more than 90,000 lightning strikes. And back in the year 2000, when we had the big fire year, where the southern Bitterroot, for example, burned in 360,000 acres, in one lightning storm that went across that area, there were more than 80,000 lightning strikes recorded. So this is one of the origins of fire, and why fire has a strong historical context in our ecosystems. But also we get these low elevation or these valley effects. It's called valley breathing, where you get water condensing down in the valley bottoms. And so, for example, I live 1,000 feet higher elevation than the city of Missoula. This is the Missoula Basin that you see in this picture up in Evero. And often during the winter, the sun will be shining at my house. It's 32 degrees, but Missoula, that sits in the basin, is at 15 degrees, and it's socked in with clouds and fog. And so that has a profound impact on the vegetation as well. And this occurs in the summer and the spring and the winter as well. So, and Bozeman is no different, except that the Gallatin Valley is much larger. And so you don't get a small climatic effect there. So fire, of course, is a big part that's played in all of this. These storms will create fires. And I'm not sure why that slide was in there. Somehow it got shifted out of order, but wind is a big factor that comes with these weather patterns. And so this is a picture I took in central Montana. And you see that big cloud in the distance. That is one farmer plowing his field. And that's all the dust just from one plow. But wind is an incredibly important factor when we have fires, because fires are dictated by the climatic patterns and the weather that we have at the time, mainly how dry it is, how hot it is, our fuel loading, and wind is the big mitigating factor because it adds oxygen and it can move a fire very rapidly. So fires that are wind driven are some of the most unpredictable and the most dangerous that we have across the landscape. So moving back to this overall picture, these moisture and weather patterns kind of create two different forest types across Montana, which have a big impact on fires. So the area of the Northern Rockies that gets the biggest Pacific coast influence, the northwest of Montana, really has many different forest species and types that you also find over on the coast, starting with western red cedar as the wettest types, Grande-fir, white pine, larch. And to the east of that line, we lose those wet species, and we're really dominated by Douglas-fir, lodgepole pine, some subalpine fir and spruce in the high elevations, and ponderosa pine in the dry central or eastern part of Montana. And so we can, for example, look at this map of ecoregions. This is vegetation types based on temperature and moisture, and impose that same line on there. So the green and the blue are the wetter sites, and the more you transition into gray or light green or yellow, those are the drier zones based on precipitation, which has a profound impact on vegetation and a huge impact on how wildfires behave and the historic and ecological role that wildfires play across Montana. So I created this diagram kind of to illustrate how mountains interact with climate. So if our climate is coming from the west, our weather patterns, that Pacific air, it hits the mountains, and as it raises, it dumps a lot of water. And once it's over the mountains, it recompresses as it goes in the valley. And because it lost a lot of its moisture, that dry air, as it compresses, heats up a lot faster. So water is real resistant to temperature change. It absorbs a lot of energy to change it at all, whereas air without moisture in it changes temperature very quickly. And that's often why you go to places like Missoula and it'll be cool and wet, and as soon as you go over the mountains over to Helena, it'll be 10 degrees warmer. And you really see this in the summer with our maximum temperatures, where northwest Montana, high temperatures are in the 90s, and as soon as you cross the Continental Divide and you're on the east side of the Continental Divide, you're in the hundreds. And that's simply because of how this air moves across these mountains and how much moisture it has. So, and it's that moisture in the air, the relative humidity, that has a real strong impact on the species that live there, the tree species as well as understory species, but also how fire behaves, because low humidity dries out the fine fuels, and it's the fine fuels that drive fire. So just to give you a little visual of how these forest types can change across the landscape, this is a northwestern cedar hemlock forest type where there's 40 inches of rainfall a year, and vegetation is mainly limited by how much light it can get. Light competition amongst these trees is the biggest factor. It's not too different than a tropical forest where, again, the water is not limited, but light is limited. We move a little bit drier, and we move into the Grande-fir zone. So it gets, this is about 30 inches annual precipitation. Not enough moisture to support western hemlock and cedar, but Grande-fir is also a very shade-tolerant species. It also requires a fair amount of water. And so you get these, again, very productive, dense forests, and the more water-loving species are also shade-tolerant, so you get both understory and overstory canopies in these forests. As we, and the other thing is they're also very high productivity forests. These trees will grow at twice the rate as they grow in the drier parts of Montana that are east of the Continental Divide. And with those high growth rates comes a lot of biomass, faster mortality in a lot of these trees, and so we get a lot of woody debris accumulation in these wetter forest types. And so just from a landscape perspective, this picture is taken from the Continental Divide with Idaho looking eastward. And these are the classic wet forests of the Northwest that are really the wood basket. They grow trees really fast. And as far as fires are concerned, they're kind of in the mixed or infrequent fire regime. They don't burn often because it's usually too wet for them to burn, which causes fuel accumulations to really build up. And when we do have a real dry stretch, these tend to burn in catastrophic events over millions of acres. The famous burn of 1910 that burned 5 million acres in 3 weeks burned right in this region. I'm standing right in some of that 1910 burn area where I took this picture. Now, as we move east of the Continental Divide, we get into these drier forests that are really central, southwestern, and eastern Montana, the island mountain ranges, the little belts, the snowies, etc. And here moisture becomes very limited, and particularly the interaction of sunlight on the landscape has a profound impact on forests. So south and west slopes that get heated by the sun every day through direct sunlight dry a lot faster than north and east slopes. And so here, that magic number of 16 inches of rainfall a year for trees to grow really deviates a bit, because what we really need is 16 inches of effective rainfall or precipitation. That means moisture that makes it into the soil. So on these landscapes, snow or rain that falls on the south or west slopes, about half of it evaporates right back into the air, never makes it in the soil. So in this, when I'm looking across this picture, which is actually Granite County near Phillipsburg, Montana, what you're seeing is an area that gets about 25 inches of precipitation a year. So all of these mountains should be covered with trees, but the south and the west slopes get hit by the sun, and that 20 inches, half of it evaporates back in the air. So you have grasslands because the amount of rainfall and snowmelt that actually makes in the soil is only 10 inches. Just because of that interaction with the sun. Whereas the north and the east slopes get the 20 inches, and that's why it supports trees. So we moved to central and south Idaho, the same kind of diagram, but it's much simpler from a tree species perspective, and in some ways ecological processes, because we no longer have 9 tree species we're dealing with. We're mainly dealing with 2 tree species, and sometimes 3 or 4. So lower elevation ponderosa pine, mid elevation is Douglas-fir and lodgepole pine, and I'll expand a little bit on explaining how that works. And the high cold is subalpine fir or spruce. And so, to give you again a visual of that, so here the lower elevation doesn't get enough rainfall to support trees. You can see right where that temperature elevation gain causes precipitation to drop. So that zone between grassland and trees is right where it starts to reach 16 inches of rainfall. And the top of those mountains might be getting 30 or 40 inches as snowfall. And so when we look at these forest types, the higher elevation, mid elevation is typically lodgepole pine that has a really unique ecology and relationship with fire. But Douglas-fir is also found in the same places. It plays a really different role, and I'll expand on this a little bit more. This is really kind of fascinating, the way these 2 species interact with each other. And then as we go lower elevation, ponderosa pine becomes a much more important tree species because it can take heat more. It has a deep taproot. It finds water and cracks and fissures in the soil. So it actually can find water better than Douglas-fir can. And then we get into more eastern Montana, where we lose the Douglas-fir, and it's purely a ponderosa pine forest that really varies across the landscape. And this is the most eastern ponderosa pine forest along the Missouri River in eastern Montana, south of Malta. And again, it has to deal with the little climatic microsites that exist there, where you get a little bit of fog and rainfall that gives it enough moisture to grow. And it grows well, but it doesn't grow tall. And so from a timber perspective, we always joke that the ponderosa pines out there are 30 feet tall, 3 inches wide at the base, and the stem looks more like a carrot, which of course makes it very unsuitable for any kind of lumber production. And I get lots of questions from ranchers out there that really don't like the ponderosa pine because it interferes with their grazing, and pregnant cows that eat the pine needles will have abortions. Because there's toxins in the pine needle. So they are always looking for markets to get rid of these ponderosa pine trees that some of them affectionately call green slime rather than forest, because it really is a detriment to their ability to make a living off the land. But it is, these are these systems as they've always existed. So how forests function, it plays an integral role on the role that fire plays. And so we call this a process succession. And so where trees can grow, you need a seed to land, and those seeds then establish as seedlings. And that is the most critical phase of any tree, is that seed when it germinates, and that first couple of years when that tree seedling is growing, because it has a shallow root system, it has to compete with grasses. And if we have a summer drought, the seedlings will die. So you really need a seed source or a good seed crop with a couple of wet summers for these trees to establish. Once they're established, if we're in a system that has more than 1 tree species, so this would be a simple ponderosa pine forest, only tree species that really grows there. We're in the slightly wetter types where we pick up Douglas-fir or Grande fir or subalpine fir, any of the more shade tolerant species. Then once these sites are shaded, the Douglas-fir that can't tolerate the high temperatures from the sunlight has an opportunity to establish underneath the ponderosa pine. And so this kind of sequence is almost how all of our forests work, with the exception of the ponderosa pine zone that only supports ponderosa pine because it's too dry for the other species to grow there. Now, you may all have heard about the fire, the interaction of fires and the frequent low intensity burn that people talk a lot about. And often the role of Native Americans that they played because they used fire a lot to burn these areas to keep them open and clear, to attract game, etc. So when you have frequent fires under these ponderosa pine stands, it kills the Douglas-fir and lets the ponderosa pine grow bigger and older. Without the fire, then eventually the Douglas-fir will take over, and now you have more fuel, and it changes the kind of fire that you're going to have. This entire sequence can take anywhere from 100 to 800 years to happen. It depends on where you are on the landscape, how much moisture there is. And so, like I said, I'll expand on this a little bit further. But there's another important process that's going on here. And so this is the same successional sequence, but what it focuses on is the physiology of trees. Okay, so trees produce needles, and those needles absorb sunlight to produce sugar, but in the process of absorbing carbon dioxide, which the sunlight then provides the energy to turn into sugar, they lose water. So anytime the humidity is lower than about 98%, the air has a tremendous suction on water. And so especially when you get into central or eastern Montana, where the summer relative humidities are down to 15, 30, or on a wet day, 30%, the suction that dry air has on this forest surface is tremendous, and it pulls water out of these trees. And the more leaf or needle area these trees have, the more water gets sucked out of them. So as these forests evolve into single canopy or multiple canopy forests, the amount of leaf area increases dramatically. And in forestry ecological terms, we call that leaf area index. So at the beginning, a grassland with just a few trees might have a leaf area index of 3, which means there's 3 square feet of leaf area per square foot of soil surface. Okay, so imagine 3 sheets of paper stacked over a soil surface. Okay, so that's 3 square feet of leaf area. And they might lose a gallon of water a day. Well, as a forest develops, just the single canopy ponderosa pine forest will reach a leaf area index of 5, maybe even 6. So now there's 6 sheets of paper over that soil surface, each paper which is transpiring water into the air. So that water is getting sucked out of the soil at twice the rate as the grassland. Now we add a shade tolerant species like Douglas-fir into this, and we get to the right side of this diagram, we may have a leaf area index of 8 to 12. So now you have 4 times as much water use off of the soil than you originally started off with. And the double whammy on that is this dense forest canopy also intercepts rainfall and snowfall. So when you get these dense forest canopies, and say you're in a 30-inch precipitation zone, those tree canopies can actually accept half of that. Half the rainfall, half the snow, it hangs up in the needles and it evaporates back in the air. So now instead of being in a 30-inch effective precipitation zone, we're in a 15-inch effective precipitation zone. Only 15 inches of that rain or snow makes it into the soil. And then these forests get extremely drought stressed and they start to die. And then there's a lot of fuel, and you can guess what happens then. So it's kind of important to think about how these processes occur, because that really sets the stage for the interaction of fire with these forests. So if we take a landscape perspective, and I'm going to show you a little bit how these interactions work with fire over time. So here's a picture, for example, of the crazies. You know, they're just this picture perfect mountain range, and when you look closer, you see the belt of trees that is in mid-elevation. So that's where the 16 inches starts. And as we move higher in elevation, we might move to 30, 40 inches of rainfall, or snowfall in this case, as you can see the snow accumulation there. And this is the home of this Douglas-fir lodgepole pine ecosystem that I'm going to go into greater detail on, because how these systems function is really critical on the role that fire plays. So lodgepole pine, as many of you may know, is what we call a fire-adapted species. Not in the sense that mature trees have the ability to survive fire, but they produce what are called serotinous cones. And so this picture, these cones are glued shut. And in that process, they protect the seeds of the tree inside. And when a fire burns through, the heat will slowly cause those cones to open. So when the main fire is passed, the cones are open, and now the seeds that have been protected from the heat fall out, and they reseed this burned landscape back to lodgepole pine. And that's the Yellowstone ecosystem, for example, is a lodgepole pine forest. So lodgepole pine is actually preferred and enhanced by stand replacing forest fires. It's an adaptation that this tree has developed where the mature trees actually support fires, and that actually then gives them an ecological or competitive edge over all other tree species. And I'll go into that in greater detail here. So those cones open. So this picture is 1 year after forest fire that burned through a lodgepole pine forest. And these are all little lodgepole pine seedlings that came out of these cones that were sealed shut, protected from the heat, and then opened as a result of the fire. Just to expand from that a little bit, you see the burned forest. And these trees will come in sometimes as many as 30 per square yard. And so here's a picture of the Fridley fire that burned in 2001 just south of Bozeman, Trail Creek. And so I took this picture about 11 years after that area burned. This was a lodgepole pine forest. And you can see how the lodgepole pine has really very prolifically regenerated because of this stand forest replacing fire. And the lodgepole pine that gets bigger, and over about 60 to 90 years, depending on how dry the site is, it develops into this kind of a dense forest that's very unique to lodgepole pine. It kind of has a zen-like appearance to it. Not a lot growing in the understory. It's, in this case, huckleberries or bear grass or pine grass or elk sedge. So they have this kind of clean appearance. But remember, lodgepole pine likes fire once it's mature. It starts to produce cones at about 8 or 9 years of age already. And so this stand is about 90 years old. And now we have that big leaf area. It's getting drought stressed because of the snow interception. And the trees are starting to get really stressed. And that sets the stage for another character in this story, which is mountain pine beetle. Mountain pine beetle is co-evolved with lodgepole pine. So when lodgepole pine reaches a certain maturity, we usually say around 90 years of age, it gets stressed. So it doesn't have enough water to defend itself. And the mountain pine beetle finds a great food source, and it will kill vast swaths of lodgepole pine. So the outbreak that hit us in Montana in 2005 to about 2012 killed over 12 million acres of lodgepole pine, mature lodgepole pine. And it's pretty devastating to look at, but this process has been going on for hundreds of thousands of years, and for a reason that I'll get into a little bit more. But the lodgepole pine then dies from the mountain pine beetle. Remember, these cones are still, or the seeds are still protecting the cones. Even if the trees die, those seeds can stay viable in the cones for over 30 years. So now we have a tremendous fuel buildup, and we get a weather pattern that comes across that puts down a few lightning strikes, and the whole thing goes up in smoke. And so this is a picture of the Fridley fire, 2001, that in a matter of weeks burned 25,000 acres, which was 90% lodgepole pine. And so here's a picture of a rancher that I worked with. This is his lodgepole pine forest that burned up in the fire. And of course, he was devastated because he lost his forest, or so he thought. But we kind of worked through this. And so that's what his forest looked like. And showed him that right after the fire, this is an elk track, and it's filled full of lodgepole pine seeds that has already fallen off out of the cones. And those little white specks in the shade, those are all lodgepole pine seeds. And so the cycle starts right over again with lodgepole pine. Okay, and just to give you an idea, this was right after the fire. You can still see some smoke down in the central middle of the picture. This is that same scene 10 years later, where the entire burned area that had lodgepole pine is now dense lodgepole pine again, just in a younger phase. Now, some interesting little asides that add complexity to this plot, because remember, this is a book with multiple characters and multiple subplots. So this is this ranch owner's property, And that island of trees is actually a clear cut that he had put in about 10 years prior to the fire. He had made some little openings because he wanted to enhance habitat for elk and also maybe get a little bit of grazing for his cows up there. And you'll see in subsequent pictures that younger trees, in one hand, might be more susceptible to a surface fire, but in the lodgepole pine ecosystem, they have more moisture because they don't have that dense leaf area, so the snowpack accumulates there. So when this fire burned through 25,000 acres, when it hit these patches of younger trees, it couldn't burn them because the moisture inside the trees was high enough to be somewhat heat resistant. And so those needles didn't dry out. And this is also critical because this whole landscape had lodgepole pine as a dominant species, but Douglas-fir, subalpine fir, and spruce also existed in a mosaic, a mixture on this landscape. And when the lodgepole pine promoted this massive stand replacing fire, those other species don't have the same mechanism. They died, and their seed sources died. The only place that a seed source exists for those trees are in these little refugia, these little areas that didn't burn. So by putting in those small harvest units, this landowner actually created little genetic island seed sources for the other species that now have a chance to expand out of these refugia and play an important role on the landscape. Had he not done that, then more of the landscape would have been very simplified by this fire, and it would be all lodgepole pine, and you wouldn't have subalpine fir or Douglas-fir anymore, or spruce in it. And even when we look at the way the fire burned, so here's another shot. You see there's a mosaic. In some places, the fire was so hot where the fuels were so high that it even killed the seed sources in the serotinous cones of the lodgepole pine. So you always come back with kind of a mosaic. Most of the landscape is dominated by lodgepole pine, but you find patches without trees. And well, let me go back, sorry. Patches without trees that are going to become forest meadows that play a host to a whole variety of other plants like lupins and Indian paintbrush and things like that. So, you know, fire plays a multiple role across this, and the weather, the topography, and the fuels that they're burning through will determine how much of a mosaic exists after the fire burns through and what the fire behavior will be. So, but that's only part of the plot. Okay, so we've just gone through chapter 1 of this novel of forest ecosystems. And so I've kind of diagrammed how this lodgepole pine system works. About on a 90 to 160 year cycle, on average, every 120 years, lodgepole pine forests get stressed. Mountain pine beetle kills a lot of trees, a lot of fuel. Fire comes, burns it all up, and it kicks it right back to the start where those seeds then regenerate and the lodgepole pine grows back. 120 years later, boom, the same thing happens again. So it's a self-winding watch that goes over and over and over again. But our climate is not a stable thing. So if we have a climate that never changes, the winters are always the same, the summers are always the same, then this might occur. But we don't have a climate like that. We have wet cycles and dry cycles. So when we have a wet cycle, the lodgepole pine forest may not burn. And remember I mentioned there's other species that live in there, usually in a minor component. Douglas-fir is one of those, and it's a shade-tolerant species. So if the lodgepole pine forest doesn't burn, it slowly seeds in with lodgepole pine, and because lodgepole pine can regenerate in the shade, it over time becomes a dominant species on that site. And I'll show you how this works, and you can see the timeline on the bottom of the slide. So the lodgepole pine forest itself may cycle in 120 years. If when that lodgepole pine forest starts to die off because it's stressed and mountain pine beetle, if there's a 50-year period or even a 10-year period where it doesn't burn, lodgepole or Douglas-fir can form a foothold, and it can become the dominant species on that site. So here's an example of a lodgepole pine forest that started to fall apart because of mountain pine beetle and it got too crowded, too stressed. So it's either going to burn at this point, and if it doesn't burn, you can see in the understory, Douglas-fir is starting to become a dominant species because lodgepole pine, without disturbance, without full sunlight, those seeds won't be competitive. They need full sunlight to grow, and the cones won't open really well. And so if we track this stand over time, then eventually the Douglas-fir becomes bigger, the lodgepole pine dies out, and this stand then converts to a Douglas-fir forest. So on a timeline, this site used to be lodgepole pine. You can see the dead lodgepole pine on the forest floor, but it's been now 200 years since it burned, and Douglas-fir has become the dominant species. It's taken over. This is that successional process of shade-tolerant species. And of course, over time, Douglas-fir will do the same thing that lodgepole pine does. It gets too crowded. It gets old. Old trees do die. They become less efficient. They get drought stressed because, again, we're in that canopy interception of rainfall and snowfall phase, and they start to die. They get root disease in them. They get Douglas-fir bark beetle that does the same thing that mountain pine beetle does to lodgepole pine. They get spruce budworm, which you've seen plenty of down in the Bozeman area, Bridger Canyon area, that then starts to really stress and kill the Douglas-fir. And boom, we have a heavy fuel loading, a good lightning strike, and the whole thing burns up again. So this was a Douglas-fir forest that might have had 5% lodgepole pine in it. But and this was actually the Bridger Foothills fire, one of the portions of the landscape. I just took this picture a couple of weeks ago. And so this was then a totally natural event. The Bridger fire was a wind-driven fire, which made it extremely dangerous, and why it went from 400 acres to 7,000 acres in one day. But now this Douglas-fir has been killed by the fire. Again, this is part of the natural cycle of what occurs out there and has been occurring for hundreds of thousands of years. Douglas-fir and lodgepole pine have been around for about 1 million years. Okay, so this species, these interactions are nothing new to them. But because now it's Douglas-fir, and Douglas-fir does not have the serotinous cones, you know, there is a chance that you won't get trees back on that site if there is no lodgepole pine. So the whole sequence, this whole interaction between lodgepole pine and Douglas-fir is in this diagram. So on the left side, we have that lodgepole pine cycle. On the right side, we have now Douglas-fir takes over because we had a wet climatic phase. And then at some point, that Douglas-fir forest gets too dense, heavy fuel loading, and that forest goes up in smoke, and it kicks it right back to the beginning, where now you have these hot, dry slopes. And if you have a seed source for lodgepole pine, it will start this whole cycle over again. So when we look at these forests, it's not a simple picture. It's not a static picture. These are highly dynamic systems that can cycle over anywhere from 120 years to 1,000 years for them to complete their whole cycle. These are the natural processes through which these forests have evolved. And that's why, very interestingly, a lot of these conifers have more genes than humans do. They have this incredibly complex genetic makeup that most of us, we don't know what they're doing with 90% of their genes because they're just there. We don't know what they do. But it is an artifact of them surviving different climatic periods, different disturbances. And so they have this tremendous genetic robustness built into their system to handle all of these different things that happen. So, but, you know, again, a few more parts to this. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes, like with a Douglas-fir forest, if you don't have a seed source or you have a species that's there that can't survive the fire, and again, lodgepole pine is the only species that can survive as a seed through a stand replacing fire, a portion of the landscape may end up converting back to grassland or shrubland. And this, again, is nothing new. Then over time, those few islands of trees that survive the fire will slowly start to cover the landscape again. And so we see this a lot in central Montana, but because our lifespans are relatively short compared to the life cycle of trees and forest ecosystems, we don't see this whole picture occurring. This whole cycle occurs. So right here, if I go and age these trees, there's about 4 or 5 Douglas-fir out there that are 400 years old. Surrounding them is a population of Douglas-fir trees that are 200 to 100 years old. And surrounding them, the smaller trees are another wave of Douglas-fir that are about 20, 30 years old. Each of those cycles coincides with when cones were produced, seeds were produced, and it was a wet series of summers that allowed those tree seedlings to get a foothold in the grassland. So with regard to fire across these ecosystems, so I just talked about one interaction. That's the Douglas-fir lodgepole pine ecosystems, which would be in the upper half of the Douglas-fir zone on this mountain ecosystem diagram. Each of these forest zones has its own unique natural history and interaction with fire. So it gets complicated. There's all these, like I said, a lot of these little subplots going on within this landscape. And so we can break down the role of fire in the drier sites that historically, most of the time, had frequent fires. And because they were frequent and they're dry and low productivity, fuels didn't accumulate a whole lot, which kept the fires as low severity. As we get wetter, then we get longer cool wet periods when fires can't burn. And so we get patches of high fuel concentrations, and it all depends whether it's lodgepole pine or Douglas-fir. And so the fire is going to behave differently in that. And so rather than in the frequent low severity fire where we might have had a fire burn through there every 3 to 15 years, the mixed severity fire might have burned every 10 to 200 years. And then we have the wetter forest types, like the 1910 burn up northwestern Montana, where they may only burn once every 500 to 1,000 years. And so we call that the infrequent high severity fire. And they all have their own natural history and how they've dealt with this, and how these landscapes were forested. And I'll expand on that. But we also have areas, it's worth mentioning, that may never have burned. Okay, so you hear a lot about fire and what people call fire-dependent forests. Okay, fire-dependent means that without fire, these forests will cease to exist. They need fire to exist. And lodgepole pine might be as close as we get to fire dependency. Without fire, lodgepole pine will be at a disadvantage because it can't reseed under itself because it needs disturbance. It needs full sunlight for its seedlings to grow. And without fire or disturbance, the landscape may convert to Douglas-fir, Grande-fir, or Western red cedar, and we'll lose lodgepole pine out of that system. But most species we have are fire adapted. Fire adapted means they have a strategy to deal with fire, but they don't need fire to exist. And so most of our landscapes, most of our forests are fire adapted, not fire dependent. And that's really important when we talk about how we interact with fire. And again, just to give you an example, so the very frequent interval fire will burn like this. It burns through the surface, not a lot of fuels down there. And it tends to kill little Douglas-fir seedlings, which maintains a more open forest condition. And this is most prevalent in ponderosa pine forests. So for example, this is a famous Prim's Meadow outside of Missoula. So this area actually is in a really cool wet site. It should be subalpine fir, lodgepole pine, Grande-fir. But it was used a lot by Native American people because it's a nice flat area next to a creek, a lot of huckleberries, and they burned it a lot. These ponderosa pine trees are 560 years old, and they have been maintained by frequent fires. And when the Native Americans were moved off of this landscape, this area was actually homesteaded by a couple of cattle ranchers that wanted the grass. So they kept the Douglas-fir out. And the timber rights were actually owned by Anaconda Corporation. And they were always after Anaconda, cut down these darn trees because they're interfering with their grazing. Back then, the foresters saw that this is a really unique stand of trees and we don't want to cut them down because they're really unique. And this stand is now under a Nature Conservancy protection. It's 80 acres and it's an abnormality. It shouldn't be there. It's only there because of the frequent fire. That was actually, this stand was created by Native Americans, and we have lots of stands like that. Now, we lose that frequent fire, or we get into these mixed severity fire types. Douglas-fir again here produces a lot of what are called fire ladders. Fires really move through fine fuels. The heavy fuels might play a role, but it's the fine fuels that really dictate how fire behaves. So lichens, dried twigs, cured grasses are really the driver behind fire. And to give you an example, here's a sequence of pictures I took on a wildfire that I happened to be on. So I was on the fire line, and you can see behind this red arrow, fire kind of started to flare. It was smoldering around down in the duff. It got into a patch of dried grass. It caught the grass on fire, and you can see the flames. The grass caught a clump of shrubs and small trees on fire, so you can see how now that fire is climbing up into the canopy. And at this point, it started to really get into the canopy of the trees. So we backed up quite a bit, and eventually it ended up torching out a tree. And that's how fire goes from a surface fire to a crown fire. It is a fuel ladder situation that many of you have probably heard about. And so we can define fire by surface fuels and torching or crown fires of trees. And for a surface fire to turn into a crown fire, we need to have fire ladders. We need to have a way for that heat to go up into the crowns of trees. And sometimes if the canopy is dense enough, it will trap the heat. So the whole canopy will just trap enough heat till it reaches a flash point and the whole thing bursts into flame. And once we have a crown fire like this, it's a totally different fire behavior. This is the one that kills trees, and the only species that will survive this kind of fire is lodgepole pine because of its serotinous cones. Now, a lot of fires will burn in a mosaic on the landscape based on the fuels that are there. So, you know, here's a forest that had a mixture of young and old trees, different fuel conditions, and so the fire burned in different severities and intensities based on the fuels that were out there. So this is a mixed severity type of fire that leaves a mosaic on the landscape. And I would say probably 75% of Montana's forests historically, most of the time, burned in this way. But again, that historic perspective is a kind of a misleading thing, and I'll explain that as we move along. Now, once we get a crown fire moving across a larger portion, this is kind of the landscape it leaves behind. And if it's really in a contiguous fuel loading, so the fuels don't change, we have a forest with dense canopy over a large portion of the landscape, it will then burn as a crown fire across a large portion of the landscape. So this is how fuels can really impact, and forest conditions can really impact how fire behaves across the landscape. And so this forest actually was a late successional lodgepole pine forest where mountain pine beetle was in there. It was ready to burn. And so this fire just started that lodgepole pine forest back over again. But in the process, it burned outside of the lodgepole pine into Douglas-fir and other tree species. And so lodgepole pine here has gained the advantage, and this lodgepole pine patch will now be several thousand acres larger than it was before this fire. Now, most landscapes across the Northern Rockies or forests, that is, are highly fragmented, and they're fragmented by this moisture topography interaction. So here's a pretty good picture that shows south and west slopes don't support trees real well, north and east slopes do. Same precipitation across there, it's just the impact of aspects, so sunlight on these. We have the same thing going on in these denser forest systems. You just don't see it as well because it's all tree canopies. So you don't see the species because it just all looks like trees. Now this is a great picture because it shows western larch. This is actually, I live right at the base in the valley bottom of this hill where I'm broadcasting from now. But anyways, the larch has its own fire ecology in that it's very long-lived. It produces very light seeds to the millions, and its whole strategy is to survive a fire with its thick bark, taller growth, long lifespan, and when a landscape burns, its seeds floats for miles and miles and miles, and it reseeds the landscape wherever it burned. The larch needs a disturbance to grow. It won't grow without disturbance. Again, just like lodgepole pine, it can't grow in the shade of other trees. And the larch, of course, is deciduous, so it turns this beautiful yellow color in the fall, which is starting to happen right now. And what's really interesting on this landscape is on the left of this, in 2001, this was the Schley fire that burned. Okay, now look at the pattern of that and compare it to the pattern of the yellow larch to the right of it on that mountainscape. And what you see is the Schley fire created a burned area that, by the way, now 20 years later is 90% seeded in with western larch. It's turning yellow right now outside my front window. But those other yellow patches are past fires that occurred 100, 200 years ago where the larch has grown in there. So you see that this fire pattern is doing what it's always done over the last 10,000 years of the Holocene. And, you know, this is how these mixed severity fires work across the landscape. And we can take any forested setting, and if we look at the species and the age classes on there, we see the influence. So this hillside is a result of 4 different fires over 200 years. And it left different trees, created different patches of trees. And this is the ecology of most of the Northern Rockies. It's this patchy mosaic, this quilt of different tree species and different disturbance processes that have occurred. Now, not everywhere, of course. So we go back to our lodgepole pine forest here that's hit by mountain pine beetle. And so there's a little patch of Douglas-fir that was excluded. It's in a riparian area. It didn't burn last time and it survived. Okay, we look at the Bridger fire, for example. Again, pictures just taken last week. Even though this was a wind-driven fire, and I talked to some people that were there when it burned, and they said it was 105 degrees and the wind was blowing at 40 miles an hour. So even on this, you see it burned in a patchwork. And of course, if your house happened to be in a heavy fuel zone, it didn't stand a chance because you had flames directly on your house. But other places that had their own little islands and their trees were wet because they were on their lawn and watered, they survived. But the Bridger fire was a wind-driven fire, not just fuel-driven. So up to now, I really talked about how fuels and forest conditions impact fire. But wind is the big mitigating factor in all this because, for one, wind blows embers. And those embers will land a mile in front of the fire, and they start their own fires. And so you have these mosaic of fires that will merge into a big mega fire, which is one of the reasons the Bridger fire went from 400 acres to 7,000 acres in about 8 hours. Now, anywhere east of the divide, a lot of the natural history of fires is wind-driven. So this is out near Ekalaka, ponderosa pine forests that we often think of as forests that are promoted by frequent surface fires, not in eastern Montana. These are landscapes that historically had wind-driven fires, and when they burn, it simply erases the tree off the landscape. This is the natural history of out there. It's different because of wind is such an important factor out there. And they don't recover back to forests very quickly. So for that ponderosa pine stand to slowly recolonize to where it was before may take several thousand years because it moves so slowly across the landscape. Ponderosa pine has a heavy seed. And this really is a window into the history of forests across all of Montana. So here's a 1888 picture that was taken, and pay attention to those rocks right in front of that laying soldier. So the landscape behind there is kind of a grassy hillside with patches of trees on it. This same picture taken 100 years later now shows how the forests have once again taken over this landscape, okay? So forests grow with wet weather and lack of fire. They shrink with fire. They grow back with wet weather and moisture. So when you think of our forests across Montana, it's kind of like this old slinky that just expands and contracts and expands and contracts. And that's based on the climatic conditions and the role of fire on this landscape. And to give you some illustrations, here's some research that was actually done over in eastern Washington, Oregon. So 1930 on that left picture, this is a drainage in the Grande Ronde River. The green is ponderosa pine, the yellow is grassland. And so between 1930 and 1990, you can see how the ponderosa pine has vastly expanded across this landscape. Now, we look at a wetter site. So here it's a much more complicated drainage where we have Grande-fir and Douglas-fir. Grande-fir is the blue, Douglas-fir is the gray blue, ponderosa or lodgepole pine is the mustard color, and ponderosa pine is a very light blue color. So from 1930 till 1990, you can see that this highly fragmented landscape has kind of converged into a dense forest dominated by Douglas-fir and Grande-fir. So its configuration, its tree density, its fuel loading completely changed. And whereas a fire in 1930 would have burned much more in a mosaic because you had a mosaic of fuels, the fire in 1990 is going to burn in a much larger patch because now the fuels have converged into this large landscape of heavy and dense fuels. Now, got to talk about climate a little bit because climate is the big mitigating factor, and I've kind of alluded to that. So we know a lot about climate and how weather patterns circulate on the Earth. And for example, one of the patterns that really influences us in the Northern Rockies is called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And it deals with the temperature in the Northern Pacific. So on the left side, when the North Pacific is cold, it promotes a low pressure that circulates counterclockwise. And interesting enough, Montana's warm because that counterclockwise circulation causes that California air mass to dominate across Montana. On the other hand, when the North Pacific is warm, on the right-hand side of this, it creates a high pressure that circulates clockwise that for Montana makes it a cool climatic period because that clockwise circulation draws air down across Canada into Montana. So it's somewhat counterintuitive with the ocean temperatures. And so this actually has been recorded and mapped over time. So here we have 1900 until 2020. So the red peaks are when we were in warm cycles of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and the blue dips are when we were in cool cycles of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. So you can see that we go through these different phases based on ocean temperatures and climatic patterns. But again, this is only the introduction to this plot. It gets complicated. So here's a reconstruction of Pacific Decadal Oscillation for over 400 years, well, 350 years, okay? And this is done through tree ring analysis and lake bed sediment analysis and all of that. So you see these peaks and valleys, so high periods of warm temperature, periods of cool temperature. If we impose bad fire years on this, and we know this because we have fire scars on trees in Oregon and Washington and Idaho and Montana that all coincide with the same year. So 1802, 1823, the whole Northwest was on fire, so we knew it was a bad fire year, and we superimpose that on this. It's really a no-brainer that when we're in a hot, dry cycle, the whole Northwest and Northern Rockies burns, and when we're in a cool, wet cycle, it doesn't burn because it's too cool and wet. We still may have fires, they just don't amount to these landscape level events. And there's one other thing I want to draw your attention to. If we look at that period from 1940 until 1980, it is one of the longest cool, wet stretches in the Pacific Decadal Oscillation in the last 350 years. We had other dips, but none that lasted that long. And so if you go back to thinking about how these forests function, they're all water limited. And tree regeneration survives based on getting water. So from 1940 to 1980, what do you think our forests did? Okay, here's a study done in the Black Hills that's a little bit outside of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, but it was a really unique study because it really makes the point that I'm trying to make here. And Black Hills is influenced by Gulf of Mexico. It's the same cycle, cool, wet, hot, dry. And so these lines are fire events. So you look back, this is when there were a lot of charcoal and burned fire scars found in trees. So starting in 1564 all the way to 1880, these were bad fire years, fire events. This line down here that's kind of pale blue is precipitation variability. So when it's in the blue above the line, those are cool, wet periods of time from the Gulf of Mexico air masses. Now you'll notice already that fires burned when we were in a dry phase in the Black Hills, just like Pacific Decadal Oscillation. This line, these things on the bottom, is seedling recruitment. When we go back and we age trees, this is when we got massive pulses of seedling regeneration. And you can see those occurred during the cool, wet phases. So we can explain the entire age structure and ecology of the Black Hills on these three events. When it was hot and dry, fire killed a lot of trees. When it was cool and wet, they regenerated like mad in these big pulses of trees that occurred out there. And there is nothing stable about this. It just varies based on what the climate is doing. So now let's look at, climate graphs, because we hear a lot about global warming or climate change, or whatever the terminology is these days. And many of you see these graphs where in the last, from 1980 to 2000 now, we're just getting warmer and warmer. And this is January through December temperatures. This is from NOAA for North America, for the United States. And even within this, you can see this, I apologize, actually for the Northwestern United States. Within this, you can see that cool, wet period that I talked about due to the Pacific Decadal Oscillation influence that's there. And again, it's not steady state, but it's where the peaks and the valleys are. So how warm did it get? How cool did it get? So with that extra moisture, it didn't get as cold because moisture resists temperature change, but it also didn't get as hot during the summer. Okay, Whereas if we look at October, we don't see that effect as much. So it really varies of what time of year we're talking about as well when we're talking about climate. Climate gets complicated in a hurry. But so let's look at this global warming graph that has been shown out there, where the dots and the dashes are actually measured temperature. All those blue lines, there's about 98 different climate circulation models that climatologists are using to predict what the weather is going to be like. This is the climate change that everybody is worried about, that we're warming. And these models are based just on atmospheric gases, greenhouse gases that go in the atmosphere. But for me as an ecologist, I want to know, what is the background? Okay, so nothing about climate is stable. And our existence as humans is really related back to this last change of the last ice age, what we call the Holocene, last 10,000 years. And what a lot of people don't realize, and if you look at this graph, the scale on the bottom is logarithmic. So the first 8,000 years are in that bump on the left side where Mesopotamia flourishes. The first 8,000 years was 1 to 2 degrees Celsius warmer than the last 2,000 years. Okay, then it got cool. Then we hit the medieval optimum. This is when the Vikings occupied Greenland. That's that little bump right over 1,000 years ago. Okay, and then we jumped into what's called the mini ice age. This is the bubonic plague. Most of Europe died, crop failures. It was a lot colder and wetter than it had been before. And so arguably in the 1940s is when we started to come out of the mini ice age, and we've been in another warming trend. And in an overall scale of temperature regimes, within this Holocene, the first 8,000 years has been basically, those that have studied it indicate was 1 to 2 degrees centigrade warmer than we are now. And the climate change that we talk about now is 0.5 degrees centigrade warmer than it was during the early 1900s when we were still in the mini ice age. So you got to put this into context. And it comes into context because we get in these big arguments. Is it climate? Is it fire? Is it fuels? What is it? Well, they're all tied together. You can't separate one from the other. But right now, the fires we're experiencing and the forest situations that we're experiencing are not outside the normal range of variability of the Holocene. Okay, so what we're seeing out there has all happened before. Okay, and it's within this range of climatic noise that occurs. And yeah, I'm not arguing that we're not influencing it. You know, the data and the science is there, the physics is there, that greenhouse gases do have an impact on our atmosphere, and land use changes have an impact. So our own Kathy Whitlock, Professor Emeritus from Montana State University, did a lot of lake sediment analysis. These are different lakes. And she looked at pollen analysis in these sediments. And so with all of these lakes, she's reconstructed the vegetation. So after over the last 12,000 years, you can see that our forests have changed a lot over time, based in which climatic period we were in. So during the mini ice age, probably the forests we saw out there were 10% of what they are now. Because it was warm and dry and everything burned every year. And in the mini ice age, those forests then expanded rather dramatically and occupied what we're used to seeing right up until about the year 2000. And again, just to put into perspective, you know, we had ice ages. So our last 10,000 years is that short little dash on the left side of this graph. So this is from ice core. So, but you know, this is a whole nother talk, climate change. So we take this back to our forests. So now we're in this situation where our forests are very dense, because we had 100 years, we're coming out of the mini ice age, and we had that 40-year period of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation where everything was cool and wet. Nothing burned, and trees regenerated like mad. And our forests, probably around 2000, were the densest and the most expansive across Montana than any time in the last 2,000 years. And now we've been in a 30-year drying, warming period. So trees are dying. We're having massive fuel accumulations. Again, nothing that hasn't happened before, but it certainly hasn't happened in our recorded history of the last 2 centuries, which on the ecological scale, if you go back to this Douglas-fir lodgepole pine ecosystem, is a blip in time. Okay, we're dealing with an ecosystem that cycles over 1,000 years. And so this is not unpredicted. I would not say it's outside the normal range of variability. It is a natural kind of event that occurs. And so we look at the forest health trends across Montana. This is old, but this is mountain pine beetle, spruce budworm would show us the same type of thing. We can see that 80% of Montana forests are impacted by this. And they're impacted because, again, these forests are cycling based on moisture and temperature regimes that are out there. So we get down to, well, what can we do about it? Can we do anything about it? Is it fuels? Is it climate? Well, like I said, it's all of those things. But the only thing we as humans can control is the forest species composition, forest density. And we do see impacts to this. So water is the big currency for trees. If they have more water, they do better. If they're really crowded, then they have to share water with their neighbors, and they don't do as well, especially during drought periods. And so this kind of forest also does not support stand replacing fires. It'll still burn. If this would have been in the wind path of the Bridger Foothills fires, it would be totally black. But we manage probabilities. In most fire scenarios, this kind of forest is going to survive, and you can actually try and suppress a fire in this kind of forest. That's shown. We have ample evidence. So here's a famous picture, Camp 32 fire up near Kalispell. The left side of the road was left natural. The right side was thinned. The right side also burned, but fire behavior changed because the right side had been thinned and the fuels had been reduced. So the fire changed behavior, and it became a behavior that could be managed versus the left side. Here's a panorama. Sorry, I can't make any bigger than this, but basically down the middle is a fence line. And the landowner on the left had thinned their forest and cleaned up the fuels. On the right side was National Forest, and I'm not picking on National Forest. They have different management objectives and mandates, but it was dense. And so that fire completely changed behavior. There were no fire teams or anything here when it hit the different fuel loading. Now, we see this across the entire landscape. So this is in the Little Belt Mountains. And you can see that the forest, most of it in its original state has been severely impacted by spruce budworm and a whole variety of other hosts. And there's a lot of fuel, a lot of dead trees. And these are old clear cuts that were put in, that were reforested. And so totally, basically what humans have done is they've kicked that successional scale back to the beginning in the clear cuts. And on the right side, it's at the end of the scale. So this burns. And just to give you another example, so this is something that was purposely done to recreate a natural mosaic on the landscape using harvesting. Unlike, here's a patch out there. But if this burns, those areas that have different field conditions will burn differently. And we often see this, that these old harvest units have lower fuel loading, the trees have more moisture, and they don't burn as well, okay, in a fuel-driven fire. Again, if it's a wind-driven fire, the bets are off. So all we do is by managing the fuels, we can change the probabilities from the forest, say burning at a 90% chance that's going to burn as a stand replacing fire. We can reduce it down to a 30% chance. And it all depends on the conditions of when the fire burns. So back to the Fridley fire, this is one of those, that back to this little patch and the importance that this has on the overall ecology of the system. Where this burned as a stand replacing fire, it has been simplified to a lodgepole pine ecosystem. Where it did not burn, we have Douglas-fir, subalpine fir, we have a whole slew of other species that helps add diversity and biodiversity that become focal points for this landscape to rehabilitate. And fires can do bad things too. They have long-term impacts. So this is the Lolo Peak fire. Now, several years later, I just was up there this fall, and this is what it looks like 3 years later. Not a whole lot has come back there because this fire was so intense, not even lodgepole pine seeds survived because the fuel loading was so high. Another area, this is 20 years after it burned. So is this good or is it bad? Well, if you're an organism that needs these open areas, this is good. After the fire burned, there was actually a foot of topsoil on here. Most of it got washed downstream, and those people downstream weren't so happy about it. So there are impacts. So I'm going to leave you with a few parting shots and all this stuff. And that is, we can interact with nature in many positive ways. And I throw this up there because this is a coyote pup that was raised by a person, and, it's still wild. but you know, it obviously is enjoying its interaction with this person. This happens to be my mother 50 years ago. And nature is very adaptable. So my parents that like to dabble with nature and wild animals and things like that raised an orphaned raven and an orphaned coyote together. And those two became best friends, which is not something you normally see in nature, but nature is very adaptable. And, you know, it's a series of physical and biological processes that interact with us, sometimes in unpredictable ways. They will bite you. By the way, that's me, 12 years old, playing with that coyote. That I had scars all over my arms because it was a wild animal and they have sharp teeth, and it just always, you know, it bit me. Didn't mean to, but that's just the way nature is. And we need to understand how they work, and we need to keep an open mind that we're part of nature, and we have to learn how to interact with nature, and we need to learn from our mistakes. Raising a raven and a coyote ended up being a big mistake because they lost their fear of humans. And so the coyote ended up biting somebody that didn't want to get bitten. And the raven became a nuisance to people in their backyards because they're big, they're curious, and they get into all sorts of trouble. But we got to work with what's there and not fantasize about what is there. And in this day and age, when we talk about fires, there is this fantasy that fire is a good thing or fire is a bad thing. Fire is a part of these landscapes. And we're going to have fire because that's the landscape we live in. But how that fire interacts with us and how we want that fire to behave is something that we can influence and something we can interact with. And you know, in this case, I mean, these animals that are wild learn to interact. This is my brother, and our coyote used to range over 2,000 acres of land, but he loved my brother playing the trumpet, and he would come and he'd howl along with the trumpet. So, you know, this is one of those interactions. It was a very positive interaction with nature. It's the same interaction we can have with our forests. We can work with our forests within those natural cycles and those natural processes to help them survive some of the things that happen, because nature doesn't think about how things are going to go. It just reacts to these different things. And if climate change is something that we're going to be dealing with, which is warmer and drier, we know our forests are going to burn. And they may burn with a severity and an intensity that might start to get outside their historic norm of variability. So with that, if you want to know more about this, I have a bunch of videos and publications and things like that on our Forestry MSU Extension website. So you can go on that website and download and learn more about it. Contact me. We do workshops on forest management as well. There's a web page. If you don't want to write that down, just Google MSU Extension Forestry, and our web page will come up with all that information. So with that, Sarah, I think I left a little bit of time for questions, if there are any.
I did, yeah. So everyone, I just put the link that Peter mentioned in the chat. So it is clickable in the chat, so feel free to browse that. And then so far there's just a few comments. This is a very good summary of fire ecology and fire regimes in our Rocky Mountain West. Thank you. And then good job with a complex topic. Are there any questions, anyone? Please feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll have Peter answer them. I have one, if you don't mind. You had showed a picture of the 80-acre Nature Conservancy. What was the name of that again? Was it PIM?
Oh, Prim's Meadow.
Prim's Meadow.
Yeah, P-R-I-M-M.
Okay. Is that open to for the public to like walk around or?
Absolutely.
Oh, very good.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's about a 1.5 mile walk to that stand. It's behind a closed gate up Gold Creek. So just on Highway 200 northwest, about 20 miles northwest of Missoula.
Okay. Yeah, that looked beautiful. And I think that they're doing a good thing by keeping it and not logging it.
And, you know, a similar type of stand is the Girard Larch Grove up at Sealy Lake. Those trees are estimated to be 1,000 years old. Again, probably entirely preserved and created by Native American use of there. And looking at the climate, that larch grove probably was the first forest stand to establish on that site after the Holocene optimum.
Oh my gosh.
So I came out to Montana and Idaho 40 years ago, and I saw these forests, and I assumed that these forests always existed the way they do for perpetuity. But the reality is the forest ecosystems that we're dealing with are only 800 years old, since that medieval optimum and as a result of the mini ice age. So they're very young. The species are very old. I mean, they've been around for a long time, but the ecosystems we're interacting with are very young. 800 years is nothing for a forest ecosystem.
That's good to keep in mind. We do have a question. You ready? Okay. We have a few now. I was told that logging south of Triple Tree, the limestone drainage, would make fires worse. So Triple Tree folks bought the logging rights to prevent logging. Good idea? Is that a good idea?
I don't think so. I'm very familiar with that. I actually looked through it quite a bit. And that is getting in the end stage of that Lodgepole pine complex. So it's at that 120 years since it burned. There's a lot of dead trees in there. And Douglas-fir is also established in there. And so we're ending up with more fuels and the risk for a higher intensity fire in there. Logging is simply the act of removing trees. How you log it and what you leave behind is the critical part of that. So do you leave patches? Do you leave snags? What kind of fuels do you leave behind? Because if that drainage burns, one of the after effects of fire that I didn't talk about is usually flooding that occurs, because these burned landscapes do not absorb water well the first year. And so often, usually the most damage is done by the floods that occur afterwards, and something that's of concern for the Bridger Foothills fire as well. So I would have liked to have seen the groups on there, and I understand wilderness. I mean, I like wilderness, and I like areas that don't have impacts of humans on them. But we have to strategically find those areas, and we have to strategically place them so that if they do burn in a fuel-driven fire that destroys, doesn't destroy, it's the wrong word, but burns through that forest, we have a method of containing it. In the last several years, we've seen these fires burn into towns and neighborhoods, and we blame the wildland-urban interface, but the wildland-urban interface is where we catch these fires, because this is where people are doing fuels mitigation work. So I certainly wouldn't have wanted to see that entire drainage clear cut just for the wood volume, but it would have been nice to come up with a landscape management plan where we're looking at the natural processes and we're using harvests to reduce the probability of that fire being a big stand replacing fire. So I think there was some middle ground there that was lost.
Okay, thank you. That's useful. I like hiking Triple Tree, so it's interesting to think about it in that way. Here's another question. Thanks for the great presentation. And then the question is, what you say about the greater total leaf area resulting in greater water transpiration and blocking water sounds logical, but what about the same leaf area shading the ground and reducing the sun's intensity on the ground? Increased shade may also suppress ground cover, thereby reducing fuel loads on the ground and reducing fire danger. I'm not so sure this is a question, but just asking you to discuss the subject further.
No, it's actually a very good point. And you hear these arguments all the time, and they're good arguments. So tree canopy does shade the soil surface. And so you do see snow last longer under a tree canopy. And so it doesn't dry out as quickly in the spring, but we're often dealing with fires in end of July and August. And so the problem is you're getting less water delivery to that entire site. So the ideal in that is thinning or creating openings so that you're getting more snowpack on the ground, but you're leaving enough trees behind to shade the snowpack so it lasts longer throughout the year. So a dense canopy cover does allow for less sun to reach the soil surface, and it will delay the fire season by a week or two in the spring. But spring is not when I'm worried about the fires. It's July and August after drought, and at that point, the trees are really dry, and if the trees aren't getting enough water, they die, and you start getting a heavy fuel loading on that site. So again, there is merit to both those arguments, but the devil is in the detail of what time of year you're talking about, how much shade, and what aspect. So south slopes, if you're going to log south slopes, actually you want to leave more shade on the south slopes because that's where the sun has the greatest intensity of evaporating off water and snow. So the north slopes, you can actually log heavier because you don't get direct sunlight on it and your snowpack will stay there longer.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. You're not kidding. This is a multiple presentation worthy topic.
Well, there are studies that have looked at the effects of logging on drainages and watersheds.
Yeah.
I mean, the most famous is the Harvard forest, but there's others in Colorado and in Montana.
Okay.
And where forest thinning and group selections have occurred, in some places, the water yield out of those drainages is increased by 200%.
Okay, we have a few more questions. What are the benefits of allowing a fire to burn or run its course?
Well, it is a natural component of these landscapes, and there are organisms that gain advantage by fire. So the pioneer tree species, but there's also many understory forbs and grasses that will take over. There are probably microorganisms. Fire changes soil pH a bit. You get some tremendous nutrient cycling. So decomposition is very slow in our forest because it's dry. The woody debris, the needles are too dry in the summer to decompose, and they only really decompose in a short window in the spring when it warms up but the moisture is still on the ground, which might be 2 or 3 weeks. And so fire liberates all of those nutrients that are in that organic debris, and you usually get a pulse of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium for 2 to 3 years after a fire. And so, that is an advantage to the plants that do survive, and that's often why we try to plant right after fire, because the seedlings can take advantage of those liberated nutrients.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another question, could Native American fire management have influenced what we now call fire frequency?
Very much so. I'm of the opinion, and I like history, so I've read everything I can about Native American activities in Montana, and there's a lot of stuff out there. Native Americans played a huge role, and predominantly they used river bottoms travel corridors. And so when you look at the fire frequency on those frequently used travel corridors that Native Americans used, the Buffalo Road, for example, that the Nez Perce used, etc., the fire frequency is 3 to 15 years, because every time they walked along there, and in their oral history, when they left their campsite, they left fires burning, or they purposefully lit fires, because as any hunter knows, the game animals are really attracted to the vegetation that comes in after fire. That nutrient loading makes it more nutritious. And of course, those folks were looking for game animals, and they wanted to attract game animals down to where they were. They didn't want to climb up the mountains to go chase an elk around. So Native Americans had a huge impact on the role of fires on our landscapes.
Yeah. Do you consult with communities and recommend forest management steps that would reduce the impact of fire to the community?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Should homeowners practice fire mitigation?
Yes, they should. The defensible zone around your house is critical. And even the Bridger Foothills fires, a lot of those houses that survived, first of all, had houses built out of non-flammable materials. They didn't have nooks and crannies where organic debris collected in. Their landscaping allowed them to keep the fire off of their house. There were some houses that burned just because they were in the wrong location. I mean, friends of mine, their home burned because it was just the wind blew the fire right into their house, and there's nothing they could have done about it.
Man, I'm sorry, but it's hard. Okay, this is our last question that has come in, but if there are any more, Peter has graciously offered to stay until all questions are asked. So if you're shy, speak up, and we want to answer all of the ones we have. So, do you see any trend of the DNRC, and if I'm not incorrect, I think that's the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, to do more limited forest management on its lands rather than just clear-cut logging to maximize the dollars? This was the problem or a problem with the limestone west issue?
Well, that's a great question. I'll say it's also a pretty charged question. So state lands, DNRC lands, are owned by the state for the purpose of making money for the school trust fund. So they look at their landscape of how can I maximize my revenue. Now that said, they also manage under a sustainable management objective. So yeah, they do manage their lands for timber production and grazing because that maximizes revenue. When recreation is a value and potentially one that can make the state money, they would probably look at that a little more strongly on their lands. But you got to realize what their mandate is. I mean, they got to make several $1 million for the state every year because our school systems are dependent on that. So that, yeah, they have a timber focus on their lands. I think part of that is also what's critical in this is maintaining a wood products infrastructure. You know, Montana used to have a lot of mills, which was a competitive market. And so for folks impacted by the Bridger fire, they have one or maybe two mills they can sell to. And, you know, that's almost a monopoly. If you have more mills, you have more options on who you can sell to, a more competitive market. And to do that, you have to have a sustainable timber base. And DNRC is very much afraid that in the last decade or so, had they not cut at the levels they cut, we would have seen more mills go under. And once you lose the mills, then they can't make any money off their forested lands because you lose your market. So again, it's complicated. It's politically charged, of course, because there are, you know, a lot of different facets to this. But we got to remember why state owns lands. And if you want them to do other things on their land, there has to be a payback. And so with the limestone situation, they made money off of it because people bought the timber rights and they were satisfied because they need to make money for the school trust fund. Now, in the long term, does that increase the fire risk? It does. Does clear cutting the whole canyon meet the needs of the community? Probably not. So like I said, it would have been nice if some kind of compromise could have been reached there.
Yeah. Kind of a follow-up question. What would you suggest the limestone owners do with that property now?
Well, I think they ought to look at markets. Timber markets are really high right now. So there's a lot of value there. I think they should take that landscape, look at it, map it out based on its ecological condition right now. Develop a plan on what they want it to look like. So there's going to be patches of trees in there that can live for another 300 years. Some of the Douglas-fir that's in there. There are other patches of trees that are just going to turn into a jumbled haystack, a big bonfire. And so if you can target the high-risk areas, leave the low-risk areas, do some thinning, so enhance the things that people like, and at the same time mitigate some of the hazards in there, then you can recreate that mosaic that was there before and kind of reduce the probabilities of fire. Again, there is no such thing as fireproofing a forest. It's just what kind of fire are you going to see and what are the probabilities of that kind of fire being there. So they can lower the probabilities of a landscape level stand replacing fire by doing some work in there. And at the same time, manage for the wildlife and the recreational values that people have in there.
And would you be able to assist with a project like that, Peter?
I'd be willing to because it would be a good demonstration. I mean, there's only me, but yeah, I'm always willing to consult with groups that are interested in doing things like that. That is part of my role as the Extension Forestry Specialist.
Yeah. The link I added to the chat that Peter mentioned, it does have his contact information. It's within that website, so I think you can reach out to him from there. And then there's a few more questions that came in. Soils under ponderosa pine often look more like grassland soils than forest soils. How would you explain this?
Well, again, a great question. So forests don't build soils real well. They actually destroy soils, if you would like, conifer forests, because their needle drop is acidic in nature. And so usually the pH under a forest soil is around 5.5 which lends itself to a lot of leaching of nutrients. Most nutrients, the macronutrients, are cations, so positively charged. You add a positively charged nutrient to an acidic soil, it goes through, gets leached out of the system. Grasses add organic matter to the soil because they have what's called pine root turnover. So when we see grasses grow and in the fall they senesce, the roots do the same thing. So grassland soils often have that real deep, rich, black A-horizon that can be sometimes 12 inches deep, which is has a lot of nutrient holding capacity. It's the kind of soil we like to farm because of its high nutrient and water holding capacity. And so an open ponderosa pine forest, because you have more light, and if there's adequate water, will support a very healthy grass and forb understory underneath it. And those grasses and forbs build soil. That's what builds the soil. If you have a dense conifer forest, you don't have that component, and all you get is acidification of the soils and leaching. And so when trees die and they fall over, that wood is all carbohydrate. It's cellulose. It doesn't have nutrients in it, but when it decomposes into humic acid. So people will often think of wood as compost that builds soil, and it's the exact opposite. Think about when you're gardening and you're doing flowers. You put wood chips down to suppress other plants. That's what woody debris does. It actually is a soil destroyer. So, in another form of the ecology of fires, what fires do when they kill off a forest and allow it to convert into a grassland or a forbland, those soils will actually build under those forbs and grasses and become more nutritious for plants. That then allows trees to reinvade, and then the trees will spend 200 years leaching that soil, actually reducing that soil, and then it burns again, and then you need that phase of grasses and forbs again. So, there's a lot to that. That interaction between grasses and forests is something that's not really appreciated by a lot of people.
Yeah.
Sorry for the long-winded answer, but these things are complex. They're fascinating. That's why I enjoy them so much.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here. So how common, and then in whatever units of measurement you want to use, acres or fires or frequency, etc., how common is prescribed fire in Montana?
Not very common. And, there are efforts to change that, but there are reasons it's not very common, because to do prescribed fire, you're either going to burn in the spring or the late fall. Doing a prescribed fire in the summer is really irresponsible. Our fields are so dry, the risk of that fire escaping and doing some damage is very, very high. So in the fall, you typically want to do a prescribed fire after a rain and before another rain's going to come in. And we don't have many of those windows. And fires move based on fine fuels. So grasses will become flammable within an hour or two of a dry wind. And so you start a prescribed fire and a wind kicks up and those grasses surrounding that fire dry out. The next thing you know, you can have a fire moving at 30 miles an hour across a landscape. And grass fires are the most dangerous. That's what has killed the most people, burned up the most houses, because they can move at incredible speeds, wherever the wind speed is. The Boise Foothills fire, that was a grass fire, was clocked at 80 miles an hour. So our burn window and our ability to burn without the risk of that fire getting away is extremely limited in Montana. And spring fires, the fuels are so wet that you burn off the dry needles and maybe some of the cured grasses, but it can be pretty ineffective at reducing the fuel loading in a forest because they're all wet coming out of the winter. So we have a really lousy burn window for doing a prescribed fire to do it safely the way we want to. Now you go over to North Idaho, they burn a lot because they have a month in the fall where they get rain and then it calms down, they don't have the winds, and there's another front coming in, and so they can do a lot of prescribed burning there relatively safely. But in Montana, boy, if you start a fire and the weather changes on you very quickly, you can burn up a whole town.
I had actually heard if you don't like the weather in Montana, just wait 10 minutes, not even a few hours. So, yeah.
Well, again, east of the divide, wind is a major factor.
Yeah.
And wind and fire, there's an old saying that fire is a useful servant. It's a terrible master. And wind makes the fire a master.
Yeah. Okay, we have two more questions. I know you have already said that there's no fireproof forest, that it will burn, just depends on what kind of burn, but are there desirable species that can be added to a forestry landscape that can deter fire? Maybe considering homeowners, or I'm not sure if it's specific to that, but are there desirable species that can deter fire?
Yeah, most broadleaf species deter fire. Aspen, for example, broadleaf trees, because they're not real flammable. They don't have the terpenes and the pitches that are really flammable. And they rob the fire of a lot of heat because for those leaves to dry out, the fire a lot of energy gets absorbed, turning the water into those leaves into steam. And so say if I want to have trees around my house that actually protects my house, I would have broadleaf trees that are well watered. Aspens, ash trees, maple trees, linden trees, they actually, and I've looked at many houses that were actually shielded. The trees had been killed by the heat, but the trees shielded the house from the fire. There are no conifers that deter fire.
Yes, I believe that. And then so far, this is our last question. So we'll take this one and then we'll adjourn for the evening. But regarding the fuel load in the limestone forest, would you expect a fire in that area in the next 10 years, a wildfire?
Well, fire starts and fire behavior is weather dependent. So if we're in a dry summer, you get a lightning storm that goes up and puts a lightning strike into that area. Let's say there's a pretty good probability that it will support a fire.
Well, that's all we have. So thank you for participating, everyone. It means a lot that we can offer you virtual programming in this time of uncertainty. Thank you to Peter for coming and talking with us, and thank you for the link. And I'm sure you might get some interested parties to have you come and visit their homes and in communities to talk about fire management or forest management. I'm going to end the recording and the event, and as soon as the event ends, you will be directed to a survey. And like I said, I think it's maybe 5 questions, and really it is just to help us determine what future programming you're interested in, and if there's any other comments you have on what we could do better next time, please let us know. Anything else, Peter, before we sign off?
No, not all.
Okay.
It was a pleasure interacting with you.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone so much for your questions. I hope you learned a lot, and we hope to see you on November 5th at the next Belgrade Library event with Ollie at MSU. We'll have Bill West talking about National Wildlife Refuge examples. Thank you.